right, so let's get started and go to the agenda. So we're just going to give a brief introduction on this issue, talk about categories of assistance animals, disability protections in the U.S., and we'll talk about housing and assistance animals, and then public spaces, which includes shelter and service animals. So learning objectives today, we just hope that you all can gain a better and deeper understanding of the categories of assistance animals and disability protections in the U.S. Know that you'll know how assistance animals, emotional support animals, and service animals are protected in housing and in public spaces, and then learn about opportunities and resources to adopt in your program. We have a co-presenter with us today from the county, Lori, and she'll be speaking later on, and we're really looking forward to hearing from her as well. And we will have lots of cute pictures of puppies throughout this presentation, so we hope you enjoy. So again, we have been looking forward to doing this webinar because we know you've had a lot of burning questions in the community, and that you all see a lot of people with service animals and emotional support animals. Assistance animals were created in the U.S. To protect individuals with disabilities from discrimination when they need an animal to assist them. This is a really complex area of law, and there are a lot of gray areas with many overlapping laws, but we're going to try to give you a high-level overview of everything with some real-world application that really applies directly to your work in shelters and in housing. And I'm just responding to one person here. Okay, all right. Never mind. All right, so let's talk about categories of assistance animals. We may be using the term assistance animal today, and you might have heard this before, but this is an umbrella term which covers service animals, emotional support animals, and other assistance animals that help people with disabilities. An assistance animal is not necessarily trained or certified, but it can alleviate or assist with some aspects of a person's disability. Service animals, on the other hand, are trained, usually a dog, and they're protected by the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA. And service animals receive special protections in public spaces, which I'll be discussing later on in the webinar. Emotional support animals, or we might say ESAs, are assistance animals, and they are not necessarily trained or certified, but they also, similar to service animals, kind of alleviate a symptom or effect of a person's disability by providing emotional support, well-being, comfort, or companionship. And we just want to note also that there are other terms used in this area. Some lack specific meaning, and some are more specific but fall under these categories. Much of that has to do with these overlapping laws that we mentioned in sort of like gray areas or people misusing terms. So for example, companion animals is often a synonym for ESAs, emotional support animals, but we're sticking with the term ESA because it has a specific meaning used by HUD and other government actors. Other terms like guide dog or seeing eye dog for service animals, like that guides a person who is blind, or a psychological support animal, are also just terms for people who use types of service animals depending on the specific tasks that they use. So there's not a differentiation between those that's relevant for what people's rights are in terms of housing and shelter that we're covering today. So that's why we're just using these terms here. And let us know if you have any questions about that. So all of these disability protections in the U.S. come from three main areas of law: Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, the Fair Housing Act, the FHA, and the American with Disabilities Act. And there's also California law, which more broadly protects people with disabilities, but we're mostly going to be talking about federal law today. California law really coincides with that. So now I'm going to hand it over to Elizabeth, who's going to talk to us about housing and assistance animals in housing. I know a lot of you provide housing for people with assistance animals, so we hope this section is really relevant for you. All right, well, I'm happy to start getting into housing and assistance animals today. So as Ali mentioned, this is the largest category of animals that we'll be talking about today that assist people with disabilities. Sorry, just getting a little text set up. So you'll see again here kind of the chart, and we just want to orient everyone again. So remember, assistance animals is this umbrella term that includes service animals and emotional support animals, but in this segment we'll be talking about rules affecting assistance animals in housing, because the Fair Housing Act is the main set of laws that we'll be talking about that covers all of these assistance animals and as it relates to housing. So what's an assistance animal? This is an animal that works, provides assistance, or performs tasks for the benefit of a person with a disability, or provides emotional support that alleviates a symptom or effect of the person's disability. So you'll notice in both of those, the essential connection is that the animal is doing something related to the person's disability. So that's a really important thing to think about with assistance animals and how this all works. So assistance animal basics, it can be any type of animal. It can be a bird, it can be a dog, it can be a cat, it can be a horse. Any type of animal can be an assistance animal. It does not need to be individually trained or certified, which differs from some things we'll talk about later. So assistance animals in general for housing and residential purposes, no training needed and no certification needed. The person can be asked for documentation of the disability-related need for the animal, which we'll get into in a bit more detail. Some examples are a dog that guides a person who's blind or fetches items for a person who's in a wheelchair, has other mobility issues. It could be an emotional support cat for someone who has an anxiety-related disability, a bird that helps alleviate symptoms of someone's psychological disability, such as depression, or other types of animals that are helping people with some type of disability. And so again, we're going to be talking about assistance animals as they relate to housing. So the Fair Housing Act protects people with disabilities. These laws grant protections with regard to disability discrimination. So implications come up when a housing provider forbids residents with disabilities from having animals or otherwise imposes restrictions related to animals, like a blanket no animals policy or a pet deposit. And under the Fair Housing Act, discrimination in housing rentals in these ways because of a disability is illegal. Definition of disability is here. It includes physical or mental impairment, which substantially limits major life activities, a record of having such impairment, and being regarded as having such an impairment. So you'll notice that it's very general and it doesn't have any specific diagnosis or documentation requirement. And another major thing to think about with regard to the Fair Housing Act is that it is going to require that housing providers grant a reasonable accommodation to people with disabilities as defined in the previous slides. And so those types of settings that we're talking about that have to grant reasonable accommodation for assistance animals are housing, and this includes virtually all residential settings that you can think of. It can be a private landlord that's in an unsubsidized unit, so just any old renter, or it could be a private landlord that's maybe housing someone with either a housing authority voucher or a COC voucher, anything else like that. So includes all that federally assisted or locally subsidized housing as well. It also includes shelters and transitional housing. So you can really just think of it as housing and residential settings. And again, this is under the Fair Housing Act, so it all kind of fits. And I'm in love with this kitten. I hope you guys are enjoying the animals here. And so what's required of these housing providers? And again, when I'm saying housing providers in this section on assistance animals, we're talking about all of those residential settings, so shelter, transitional housing, as well as those traditional, apartments, houses, those residential settings. So housing providers have to provide a reasonable accommodation, which is a change in their policy, practice, or services that's necessary for the person with a disability to use and enjoy the dwelling. So if you talk to lawyers, they get really into this use and enjoy a dwelling piece, and it's really quite general. It's, you know, thinking of the way that someone uses their housing, uses their home, and so it's not just so they can get food or something like that. It's necessary not just for them to survive, but for them to use and enjoy their dwelling. And the interactive process is required of housing providers. There's actually an affirmative obligation that a landlord has if someone requests a reasonable accommodation, in any words that they use, to start a dialogue with that tenant or client and discuss that proposed accommodation, or they can suggest reasonable alternatives. So say someone, you know, requests that you build a lawn at your shelter to accommodate their dog that likes to run around. Maybe that's not reasonable. We'll talk more about that later. But you could suggest a reasonable alternative. And so it really is this case-specific interactive process in which the landlord or housing provider are working together to determine how to accommodate that person and their assistance animals so that they can use and enjoy that dwelling. And also no unreasonable delay in response you'll see on there. Again, there's no strict number of days. It's really context specific, but that is constructive discrimination under fair housing laws if the landlord does have unreasonable delay in responding. And so if there's an eviction process going on or something really urgent about the animal, you know, the landlord or provider might need to respond really quickly. If there's time, you know, maybe a few weeks is reasonable in, say, a housing setting. So just a little bit more about reasonable accommodation. Again, implications often come up with pet deposits, no animal policies. So a reasonable accommodation for someone to have an assistance animal, a person with a disability, to have their assistance animal on site might mean waiving such policies or otherwise providing ways to accommodate that assistance animal. And what can a housing provider request? This is probably really big on everyone's mind. I know we have a lot of providers on the line. And so if you are that housing provider, you can ask a person with an assistance animal to submit reliable documentation of a disability. Some corporate landlords or housing authorities occasionally have a form or something like that for administrative ease, and that's totally allowed, but it can't be strictly required. So you can request the documentation in a specific form in order to help the person submit proper documentation, but you can't require that some certain very specific content or format is used. You have to accept it in any way. It can actually be verbal, but it's best practice to have it in writing if for the tenant or the client, really, to protect themselves. So this documentation needs to show the connection between what the animal does and the person's disability, like we talked about earlier with regard to the definition, and show that the animal mitigates some effect or symptom of the disability. And we actually have a couple of great example letters that are pretty simple in the resources slides that we'll show at the very end. There's one from Project Sentinel that probably a lot of you have worked with that organization. They do a lot of great work around fair housing. So they have a sample letter in their packet that we have linked at the end, and also Disability Rights California. And again, we'll send out the slides with all the links to everyone on the webinar at the end. So recommend checking those out if you're interested. And just to clarify, so the housing provider cannot ask for documentation if it's readily apparent or already known that the person has a disability, and that, you know, the nexus that the animal is helping with the person's disability. You know, so if you see the animal fetching things for a person in a wheelchair, and it's very obvious, you can't ask for that documentation. It's only if it's not obvious. And the provider can't ask for extensive documentation. They can't ask for medical records. It really is just a simple making a quick explanation of what the animal does, how it mitigates some symptom or effect of the disability. And what are the limitations on assistance animals? So reasonable accommodation, you know, what's reasonable? It's another question lawyers love to talk about. So there are a few limitations on assistance animals that are important to know from the provider side, because obviously
all of us want to accommodate people with disabilities who need to use an assistance animal, but there are situations in which there are significant difficulties associated with that animal. So I want to talk that through a little bit. So these are kind of the exceptions or limitations on assistance animals. So undue financial or administrative burden fundamentally alters the nature of the provider's services or the housing. It's a direct threat to the health or safety of others, or causing substantial physical damage to property of others. And the landlord or housing provider can refuse to allow a particular animal if it falls into one of these exceptions, but they have to follow the interactive process. It can't be an automatic eviction or automatically kicking someone out of the program for one of these things, or even automatically removing the animal. Instead, the provider has to notify the person and go through that interactive process, try to accommodate, look for reasonable alternatives that can help work out the issue. Because again, this is all looking at protecting a person with a disability from discrimination for this animal that is needed. So thinking of yourself as a provider as supporting them with that interactive process is a good way to think of how to work with these limitations. So some examples here you'll see on the slides. Just wanted to throw a few out there. I won't read all of them, but for example, an undue burden might be a massive expense required to meet the needs of a particular animal. If there's a small apartment building and the person is requesting a lot of outdoor space that just doesn't exist, that might be an undue burden on the landlord. So these really extreme situations are things that are clearly undue burden. Fundamental alteration. So if there is a shelter and a person is unable to properly care for their dog, they need to walk every day and they're unable to do so, and they need shelter staff to do that. If shelter staff aren't available for that, that might be a fundamental alteration of the shelter services, because that's not what they usually do, and it's a pretty extreme ask to do something like that daily. Though again, reasonable accommodation, if there is a reasonable way for the shelter to do it, it's all about the process. Direct threat. So dogs that have bitten clients, things like that, could potentially be asked to leave if you're unable to figure out a way to make it work out with like space or kind of accommodating people in different areas, or substantial property damage in a similar vein. And failure to conduct an individualized assessment of any of these types of situations is also discrimination under fair housing law. So, you know, if something like this goes on and it reminds you of a prior situation, or it's a certain breed of dog that people are fearful of, that's not a reason to try to utilize one of these exceptions. It really has to be about an individual assessment of this particular animal. And what else should tenants and clients know? Just a couple of other things. Animal owners may have to pay to repair damage that their animal causes. So reasonable wear and tear, of course, is fine, but just something for animal owners who have assistance animals to be aware of. And again, the individualized assessment is required. You can't have blanket breed restrictions or those type of rules based on assumptions. And just a few tips for clients and tenants. So these aren't legally required, but just a few things that might be useful for clients and tenants to think of to protect themselves and just make their lives easier are there aren't any magic words in requesting a reasonable accommodation. You don't have to say those words, but it can help to say those words. So if they turn in you want to help your client turn in a letter to their new landlord requesting a reasonable accommodation, it could be helpful to just say up front exactly those words and disability and that type of thing. And encourage them to use those words just to keep everything really clear. Documenting what they do, when and how they request, being prompt and professional, say with a landlord or any other housing provider if the person with the animal can assist them readily. And it's best to ask up front, but reasonable accommodation can be requested at any time, end of an eviction process, any other time. And I want to delve a tiny bit into emotional support animals. Again, emotional support animals are treated alike with other assistance animals. So I know we talk about them a lot and we have it broken out here because there are a lot of specific questions around emotional support animals, But all of what we just talked about around housing and the Fair Housing Act, that all covers emotional support animals. So just to reiterate a few things, again, these are all the same as what we just went over for other assistance animals, but just to have you think of it in context of emotional support animals. So they are allowed in housing as assistance animals in transitional housing, shelter, private or subsidized housing. A person can get a reasonable accommodation for that disability-related need. They have to have a direct connection between the emotional support and their disability, and they may be asked for documentation. The exceptions are the same as we just discussed, so if any of those apply to an emotional support animal, same thing, you need to have that interactive process, but those apply. And it can be any type of animal, can be an emotional support animal, it's not limited. There's no specific training required related to tasks around the disability, and there's no required certification or license. So it really is about that disability and the connection between helping the person with something that helps mitigate symptoms or effects of their disability. So I hope that's all clear. And I will be handing it off to Allie to talk with you about another category of animals.
Yes, so I'm going to talk a little bit about public spaces where there are extra protections for service animals. Service animals I'm going to define and talk about, but service animals receive extra protections under the ADA in public spaces. So that's what I'm going to talk about. So we've got service animals can really be any type of animal. Or excuse me, sorry. Nope, I'm looking at the wrong notes. My bad. Sorry. So service animal basics, here we go, right slide. Only dogs and miniature horses. Whereas emotional support animals, which I misspoke just now, but emotional support animals can be any type of animal, but service animals can only be dogs and miniature horses. And there's a really funny backstory to how miniature horses got in the law, but I won't get into that. Service animals must be trained, but they do not need to be certified professionally, but they do need to be trained, unlike other types of assistance animals. The trained work or task must directly relate to the person's disability. So similar to other assistance animals, there must be some kind of nexus between, in this case, the trained work or task and the person's disability. But they do not need to be, service animals do not need to be professionally trained. They can be trained by the owner or whomever. And finally, the person who is has a service animal, they may not be asked for documentation in public spaces. Where do these protections come from, and how are people with disabilities and service animals protected? The Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, Title III, prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in public accommodations. And places of public accommodations are required to make reasonable accommodations to allow people with service animals to access their facilities. So a person who uses a service animal must have a disability, and Elizabeth defined this earlier, but again, that's a disability is any physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. And just a side note, that California law is a little bit more broad here, and it only requires a limitation on one's major life activities, not a substantial limitation. So because of the ADA, people with disabilities can use trained service animals to help them with their disabilities, which is great. So a couple examples here of public accommodations, generally businesses that are open to the public, which include shelters, restaurants, movie theaters, schools, daycare facilities, recreation facilities, basically anything that's kind of open to the public for business in general operating hours. Some examples of service animals, you may notice here, these are all trained animals, unlike the dog in the picture, which may or may not be trained. I won't make any assumptions. So a dog that guides a person who is blind, a dog that pulls a wheelchair, or fetches items for a person with mobility issues, a dog trained to alert people to seizures or low blood sugar, a dog trained to protect a person who's having a seizure, or psychiatric service dogs trained to sense anxiety attacks and take specific actions. And again, any of these could be miniature horses as well, which I can't picture as clearly as dogs doing this, but. So even though dogs are trained and these dogs, there's a little bit higher burden for service animals in that they must be trained, there are some limitations. So public accommodations must make reasonable modifications to allow service animals to access the facilities unless the modification would fundamentally alter the nature of their services or facilities. So a really easy example here is maybe a hospital wing or medical research area where it's very, very important to maintain absolute ultimate hygiene standards and they cannot allow animals in the facility. So that's a pretty extreme example, but that's a case where that would be an undue burden and it would fundamentally alter the nature of their services or facilities to allow animals in. And there are some other exceptions. So even if the animal is trained, maybe the animal is out of control and the handler does not effectively act to control it. That's an exception where a public accommodation could refrain from allowing the service animal in, where the animal is not housebroken, or where the animal poses a direct threat to the health or safety of others. So animal is aggressive, and just a note on that the determination of direct threat must be based on an individualized assessment specific to this animal's conduct. So the animal must exhibit some sort of aggressive or tendencies. A direct threat cannot be based on fears or stereotypes, generalizations, or breed. It has to be something the animal has done. So when someone walks into your shelter where you're working or brings in an animal, what do you do? Especially where it's not obvious that the animal is a service animal. And pretty easy, just ask 2 questions and 2 questions only. And only when it's not obvious that the animal is a service animal. So if you see, like in this photo, a service animal helping a person with mobility issues enter the shelter by pressing the handicap button to open the door, or where an animal is clearly leading a person who is blind. Those are obvious cases. So in those cases, you would not ask these 2 questions. But where it's not obvious that the animal is a service animal and trained to help this person with their disability, you can ask, 1, if the service animal is required to help them because of the disability, and 2, the work or task that the service animal is trained to perform. I'm just throwing a kitten in here to confuse everyone, but say you're working in a shelter and someone walks in with a cat. Would you need to ask those 2 questions? And the answer is no, because it's a trick question, because a cat cannot be a service animal, so it's only a dog. But if it is a cat and you're in a housing situation, like Elizabeth talked about earlier, which would also be shelter, you still need to provide accommodations if the animal is another type of assistance animal or emotional support animal. But you wouldn't need to ask those 2 questions necessarily. And what can't you do if someone has a service animal? So you cannot require extra documentation, can't ask about the person's disability or the nature of their disability, and can't impose a charge. If the public accommodation has to make a reasonable accommodation, can't charge for that, for the service animal. And just a note that some facilities, like we talked about shelters, rental offices, assisted living facilities, and public housing agencies must treat animals as a service animal first. So just work on the assumption that it's a service animal, and you'll be okay, because these facilities are covered by rules that Elizabeth talked about with assistance animals and service animals. So those facilities should just follow the service animal rules and go ahead and ask those 2 questions where it's not obvious that it's service animal. And it is a little bit extra burden because you've got to follow both the rules in the housing context and the ADA context. Okay. So that's it on service animals. We're not seeing any questions, I believe, so far. So we are going to go ahead and hand it off to Lori. Lori works at the San Mateo County Health System, and she's going to speak with us about local resources and shelter practices. I know she works with a lot of county providers on these issues and is super knowledgeable, so we're very excited to have her with us. And she works as animal control and licensing manager, and her title is Chief Deputy Registrar with San Mateo County Health System. So, Lori, I'm going to let you go ahead and unmute yourself. And we just want to remind you that you can definitely chat us any questions. Just go to the drop-down menu on messaging, the Messenger app, and type in any messages or questions that you have. All right, so Lori, go ahead and take it away.
All right, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, thank you for inviting me to talk on this webinar. I think it's a very important webinar for all of our providers in the community. My department is animal control licensing, and I also do vital statistics. That's where the Chief Deputy Registrar comes in. There are two items that are not related, so it's a very interesting role. For the animal control and licensing, I oversee the contract with the Peninsula Humane Society, and here at the office, we do licensing for all animals in the county, as well as doing service animal tags. We do spay and neuter vouchers and help the general public with animal control related questions. As far as the service animals, what we provide is the California documentation and tags for people that have service animals to make it more easily for them to enter buildings or get on a bus or even a plane. Once the individual is approved, they get a tag that their animal must wear at all times and a letter signed by myself or my predecessor. One thing that I want to tell everybody is that every dog in the county must have a license. So if you're running a shelter and you see an animal come in that doesn't have a license, they really should get that tag. And the service tag is their license. So you should always see an animal license. The reason that that's important is that verifies that the person that owns that dog has a current rabies vaccine, which is important in this county because we are a rabies endemic county. So just ask them if they have a current license. If not, you can direct them to my office and we can get them set up with the current license. The other thing we've recently been doing is working with the shelters. I've worked with Safe Harbor and Maple Street to, kind of look at this situation of animals coming into the shelter, and I'll go into that a little bit later. Can you go to the next slide, please? And one more. So when a person comes to my office for a service dog identification tag, they must fill out information about the animal as well as themselves. And they are going to write the physical task that the animal does and how the animal performs that task. Now, when they sign the form, they're actually signing an affidavit that they are not fraudulently representing him or herself. So that's something that comes through the California Penal Code, that somebody cannot represent themselves as needing a service animal or having a service animal. The tag, again, helps the client get access into different areas. Again, a restaurant, a bus, a shelter. So we do provide that service. It takes about 2 to 3 days to process it. The person can come back in and pick up the tag, or we can mail it to them. So that's kind of how we go through the documentation with the tags. And you'll see clearly it's a silver tag, and it'll say San Mateo County Licensed Service. That lets you know that my office has looked at it, and we have it on file that this person has signed the affidavit that they do have a service animal. And that also counts as their license tag. They must obey all state and local laws, which means having their dog on a leash. And that's one thing that I really preach, because animals can get hit by a car. We did a homeless clinic for animals last week, and somebody backed over their dog because it was running loose, and so it was injured. So I really preach that the dog should be on license or on a leash. So I would ask that all of you do that as well. If they're in your shelter walking outside, they should be obeying that law. That also includes picking up after their animal, making sure that if the animal defecates, they're picking up after that. So they must obey all of those laws. And I have not seen a miniature service animal or horse yet. I'm still waiting for that, for somebody to come in and apply for that. Okay, next slide. As I mentioned, we had just done a recent clinic. We started a new program here at the health department. And, I thought we have street medicine that goes out and helps the person, but we didn't have anything for those animals. So we've developed, and it's in its infancy, but what I have a veterinarian who will go out to shelters. We have gone to a couple different locations where we know homeless people are living. Worked with the resource center in Pacifica. And what my veterinarian does is provides vaccinations, flea control, a basic exam. If the animal, for instance, had an ear infection, she can treat the ear infection, she can treat a skin infection. What we can't do is we can't really do surgery. We can't fix lacerations. That would have to be referred to a regular veterinarian's office. What we found is that it's very receptive. The homeless people really need this care for their animals, and it also helps you at a shelter, because if we're giving those vaccinations, you can be assured that they're coming into the shelter, having their animal vaccinated, and flea control. Right now, that's a big issue because we're in the summer months. We can actually come to your shelter or location, make an appointment, we can see that animal and go ahead and treat it for fleas or give vaccinations. And you'll get my contact information at the end of this presentation. And feel free to reach out to me if you have a situation where you'd like our veterinarian to come in and look at an animal. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, I had worked with Maple Street and Safe Harbor. On this screen, you'll notice on the left, it's a cat condo. Now, this is a great tool for you to have at your shelter if somebody does bring in a cat that's an emotional support animal. The cat can be placed in this kennel, this condo, can stay in there, remain in there, has enough room to get on different shelves, sleep. You can have a litter box, and the cat's completely contained. These are also collapsible, so they're easy to store. So I recommend that everybody purchase a few of these. I think they're $130, and it's a good thing to have in your toolkit. Maple Street Shelter has just recently added kennels. I think that's another thing that's a good idea. You have somebody that wants to take a shower or use the bathroom, they could put their animal in this kennel while they go take care of that. Or let's say they have to run out real quick, their animal could go into the kennel. And my department's very willing to partner with you to come out and provide suggestions. Just recently, Dr. Lewis went to Maple Street and did a training on how to sanitize the kennels. We can do training on animal behavior so that your staff knows by looking at a dog, you know, what the signal is. Is this dog happy? Is it playful? Or is it aggressive? We're very willing to come out and help you and train you on these different areas. Again, the other picture, I thought that was just a cute one. The dogs we wish could pick up after themselves, but again, that is up to the owner. The owner needs to clean up after their animal. And next, on this sheet here, again, it's how you can get a hold of me and also our website. You can go to this website. It explains licensing, also explains how to get the service dog tags. We can provide the vaccines, flea treatment, and veterinary prevention care. The other cool thing we have is spay and neuter vouchers. Every license that's sold in the county, $1 of it goes into a fund, and we can issue a voucher to anyone. They don't have to be homeless. It can be anyone in the county, and they can get anywhere from $58 to $68 off on a spay and neuter. So it's help. It's a way to help and get that animal spayed and neuter so we have less of an animal overpopulation. Another resource is the Peninsula Humane Society and the SPCA. The first Wednesday of every month has a low-cost vaccine clinic. So that's another place where you can refer people to get services for vaccinating and getting microchips for their animals. Again, we're a resource for you. Please utilize us, ask questions. We can help you even brainstorm. How do we solve a problem? When you get your first iguana in as a support animal, I am kidding, but you could. But if you get one, then give us a call and we'll help you figure out how to house it. So thank you for having me on. I don't know if there's any questions that anybody has.
I don't see any questions in the chat box, but if you have a question, feel free to unmute yourself and ask. We just wanted to add one more thing.
Yeah, so we got one, some people are sending us questions privately as well. We got one question about, that I'll just answer really quickly, about service animals and the licensing requirements. So service animals, as Lori and we have just discussed, are protected in shelter and all public accommodations, and that's the case with or without a tag. So the ADA requires public entities, which are any people or locations covered by the ADA, to accommodate that service animal, regardless of any documentation or tagging, because it's about discrimination and it's about disability. So as a provider, you can only ask those two questions that we talked about earlier. You can't request that service animal tag or documentation. So licensing generally can be required and doesn't run afoul of the ADA for animals for public health reasons, but that's kind of a separate issue from the disability. So if someone's coming in with a service animal, the bottom line is you can only ask, is the service animal required because of a disability, and what work or tasks the service animal is trained to perform. You can give information. If someone says they have a service animal, you can always refer them to the county office, tell them that that licensing is available there, but you cannot, in doing that, inquire about the nature of their disability or require or ask them to produce documentation or a tag. So I hope that clarifies, because I know it is a little confusing, that distinction, but we want that to be clear. So
definitely we hope that you all use the resources that Lori has prepared for you. So I think giving information, like Elizabeth said, is like the perfect way to do that. We have a couple of questions here. So Just reading through these really quick.
Yeah, so we're getting some questions about kind of reiterating the differences between service animals and emotional support animals. So we're going to pull up again that chart that kind of shows visually a little bit what's going on here. So assistance animals, again, is this really broad category that actually all those rules that we talked about around housing, those protect service animals and emotional support animals and any other type of assistance animal. So emotional support animals are protected in housing, and again, shelter and some other locations are covered under the ADA, so cover service animals and cover emotional support animals and other assistance animals. The rules specifically around service animals with the ADA just cover public accommodation. So that does include shelter with that overlap, as well as public housing authorities, so some specific government housing. But generally doesn't cover private rentals or anything like that. So service animals are this kind of very specifically protected group of animals that is dogs or miniature horses. For service animals, you can't ask for documentation. It's just those couple of questions. It's really the most strongly protected in terms of practice. And so that applies again in those public places like a movie theater, or a rental office, places like that. Emotional support animals and other assistance animals, on the other hand, can be any type of animal. They don't have to be specifically trained or certified. So assistance animals generally, both service animals and emotional support animals, do not need a certification. So documentation can be requested for assistance animals in terms of what that disability-related need is, but not a certification of the animal. The only documentation that can be requested for any of these is for situations where service animals aren't protected, so other types of housing generally. You can request documentation of the disability-related need, which might look like a letter from a doctor or mental health professional. So if that clarifies, and keep the questions coming for sure, because we want to make sure that that's really clear. And someone else asked specifically, are emotional support animals required to have a license from San Mateo County? So again, no, as far as disability protections, no certifications are required, but there can be licensing requirements around, as Lori mentioned, and I don't know if Lori, you want to hop in and talk about it a little more, but licensing around rabies vaccinations and things like that for public health reasons, and those are local laws. And so those can be enforced for animals, but it's not related to their status as an emotional support animal or a service animal.
Yes, and every
Lori, yeah, I don't know if you want to jump in.
Yeah, every dog must be licensed in San Mateo County. That is a law. And in 6 of the cities, cats are required to have license. So they must have a tag for dogs or a license.
Okay, great. And Lori, another question for you that's coming up, if you have information on this locally. Someone's asking about where to get more information on service animals and employment training under the ADA. Is that something that any of those local resources you mentioned or your office supports?
It would be through the ADA. That's where you would get that information, through their website.
Okay, through the ADA website, which is great. That's on one of our resource slides. And someone also, I think, as a follow-up to our description around the documentation that can be requested for assistance animals when that animal is not protected as a service animal, whether someone can ask for an actual diagnosis, and the answer is no. They can't ask for anything very specific. They can't ask for medical documentation. They can't ask for like a specific diagnosis, and a diagnosis really isn't even required, as you might remember from the definition. It might just be that the person is understood to have that disability. There's not a specific legal template for what that documentation needs to look like, but it does need to show the nexus between the person's disability and what the animal does for them. So sometimes that often does actually say what that disability is, but it doesn't have to. And that's kind of up to that person what they're providing. So the question is really whether it's making that connection, and a diagnosis is not specifically required.
And then another question about the specific questions that can be asked of emotional support animals. I know it's pretty clear in the regs and the ADA, these two questions are what you're supposed to ask in public accommodations for service animals, those two questions that we talked about. For emotional support animals, it's not, there isn't necessarily a set of questions that you have to ask in the housing context. But if someone asks for a reasonable accommodation to waive the no pets policy, that's where you would need to react and say, okay, and start to work through that interactive process that Elizabeth was talking about.
Yeah, and asking for documentation for an assistance animal, like an emotional support animal, can be a part of that interactive process. So service animals cannot ask for any documentation. Emotional support and other assistance animals, you can ask for that documentation that shows the disability-related need. And someone asked about protection with HIPAA. I'm not sure. I would think not, because it's being given to a landlord, and this is not my area of expertise, but I am not certain that they are covered by HIPAA. But that's not something I know about. If a medical provider is giving that, then they should have more information about HIPAA and those considerations. And again, a specific diagnosis is not required in that documentation, and they can't ask for a specific documentation. I'm sorry, they can't ask for a specific diagnosis. And Lori, we actually had some questions around shelter practices that have been discussed. I know a lot of shelters are doing an amazing job accommodating service animals and emotional support animals, other types of assistance animals, which is really great to be able to work with your clients and support people with disabilities to have those animals that they need, even if they are experiencing homelessness in shelter. So one question that came up was about shelters with limitations on numbers of bottom bunks. You know, they're trying to accommodate both people with who themselves have a physical disability and might need a bottom bunk, and then also people who have animals and might need a bottom bunk so their animal doesn't fall down or things like that. So first, the safety of the animal. So what kind of advice do you have for shelters dealing with issues like that when working with clients with disabilities who have animals?
Yeah, I think it becomes a juggling act. You have to allow the animals into your shelter, so it may require asking somebody to move from a bottom bunk to an upper bunk so that the animal can't fall out. I mean, it's also asking your client. I mean, if they have a cat, for instance, the cat's probably not going to fall out of the bunk. So I think it becomes moving, you know, your supervisors are going to have to work with the individual clients and come up with the best accommodation for both. But they can't be turned away just because they have that animal.
Great, thanks, Lori. And another one that came up that's actually someone's asking as well in the chat is talking about restrooms and shower stalls. I know sometimes shelters have issues with animals actually going into the shower stalls and owners not taking care of that issue. And just wondering if you can talk some about, from your work with shelters, what kind of advice you have around those issues.
Sure. I think, you know, one of the easiest solutions is to have those kennels. And the person can place their animal in the kennel while they go into the shower. Dogs, cats, any type of animal should not be allowed to run around loose in the shelter, should not be allowed to defecate in the bathroom area, the shower area. If they do have an accident, it is up to that client to clean up that mess. As a responsible pet owner, they have to do that. The other thing you can do is have a buddy system. Have another client that's going to watch that animal while the one client takes a shower. And having that buddy system works really well. Not only is it good for the other client to be with the animal. Believe it or not, animals do lower blood pressure and do reduce stress, but it also allows the one client to go into the shower or restroom. So I ask that shelters, you know, when someone brings in a pet or they have a pet there, ask them, do they have another person that resides within that shelter or housing that knows their animal and is going to sometimes be caring for that animal? I think that's a very fair and easily question to ask them up front when they come into the shelter.
Thank you, Lori. That's really helpful. And just to clarify around location, you know, or kind of another consideration is all of this you're looking at, you know, just trying to accommodate that person and having a conversation with them about how to make things work. So some people with mobility issues might actually need their animal nearby when they're in the shower. If say they have a service animal like a dog that's pulling their wheelchair or something like that. And so it really is kind of case by case, and it can be really complicated. And so we appreciate everyone working on it and getting in touch with Lori if you want some of that training for your staff or working through those issues. She has a lot of great tips on that.
Looks like we have another question for you, Lori. Can you explain how, if an animal becomes an issue, it can be asked to leave first, as opposed to both the animal and the resident?
Yes, you can actually ask the client to remove the animal. So they would have to find other arrangements. If they can't find other arrangements, then they're going to have to go with the animal. But if that animal becomes aggressive, disruptive, and what I mean by aggressive, and I want to explain that, every dog barks, and they're going to bark when they hear noises or see another animal. What I'm talking about with aggression is that dog is lunging, it's snapping, it's growling. You can ask them to remove the animal. If the dog, let's say it's evening time and everybody's sleeping, and the dog habitually barks, and habitually is defined as anything longer than 15 minutes. If a dog is just barking all night long and disturbing all the residents, you can ask them to leave. Or if it's not housebroken, if it's, you know, having accidents all over the shelter, you can first ask them absolutely to remove the animal. And then if they're unwilling to do that, then they would have to leave as well.
Great, and just to mention, to kind of put some of the words from the training to that a little more too, from the fair housing side, that would all be part of your interactive process with that person with a disability in trying to accommodate their disability-related need. And you would want to provide reasonable alternatives, like Lori mentioned, if they're able to be there without the animal, or if they can, you know, any kind of thing that you can work out with them that's a reasonable alternative. Sometimes maybe you do have space such that you can put that client in a more secluded area or farther away from the person that's fearful of it or whatever it is. So really looking at reasonable alternatives in that interactive process and giving the client options.
Great. And we had a question about whether tenants have a burden to disclose the fact that they have an emotional support animal or service animal. And the housing, I think this is in the, sounds like in the housing context, maybe, because asking about tenants. I'll let Elizabeth answer because she presented on that section.
Great, so no, the tenant does not have to disclose ahead of time legally. So there's, they can request a reasonable accommodation for an animal, for an assistance animal, that would be emotional support animal or other assistance animal of any type. They can ask for that reasonable accommodation at any time. So halfway through their eviction process, you know, this is not a best practice. We don't recommend waiting to the last minute, but they don't have to. Again, this is as a best practice, if you're, say, working with someone who does have an animal and the landlord does have a no pets policy, as any of you doing that type of work know, you really want to work on those landlord relationships And there are other organizations that can get involved locally too. Project Sentinel does amazing fair housing work. There's San Mateo Legal Aid that can educate landlords if they're, say the landlord doesn't know about reasonable accommodations and fair housing laws. They should. They have an obligation to, but if they don't, there are resources to reach out to. So as a best practice, you do want to communicate with the landlord and have that interactive process and try to figure out something that works for everyone. But legally, no, there's not a burden to disclose that an animal is an emotional support animal or service animal. If the landlord does talk about it, they need to be upfront and have that conversation. But in terms of protecting them with a disability, they don't have a disclosure requirement.
Yeah, there are no magic words to requesting a reasonable accommodation.
Yeah, an attorney we spoke with recently was giving an example of someone who, had this animal and they were like, I can't live without it, and they were getting evicted because they had this dog, and they never said, I have a disability, but they did have a psychological disability. They just weren't able to really articulate that, and so they had trouble with their landlord around that. So that's where, as a tip, it's great to put things in writing and that type of thing, so it's not required.
Do you have any other questions?
Yeah, please keep them coming in the chat box. You can put the question privately to us or to the group. Sorry, go ahead.
There is one in there. Is there a limit on support or service animals an individual can have? And to my knowledge, there is not. Now, with that said, there are limit laws in each city of the county. So if you want to text me or email me and your shelter is situated, let's say in Redwood City, I believe you can have 2 dogs and 2 cats. So the city would then govern how many animals they can have.
Right. And another note is just that this would be, again, part of the interactive process in determining whether or not it's a reasonable accommodation. If someone has 16 dogs and are moving into a small apartment, they may want to engage in the, that interactive process, and the landlord probably determined that wasn't a reasonable accommodation and would put an undue burden on them and the property. So it's just kind of, determining what's reasonable within that process with the landlord.
And even for service animals, you're not allowed to ask for documentation about those animals, that type of thing, but there are those exceptions even in the service animal context so that, the landlords aren't getting run into the ground by, again, the 16 dogs for the one person. Yeah, so there's no specific limit, and also we would recommend against, putting any type of firm limit because it really has to be context specific. So you don't want to say, even if probably it's not going to work out for someone to have 10 dogs, you probably don't want to try to put a number on it as a shelter or as a housing provider in order to not run afoul of these fair housing and ADA protections, and you really just want to look at it case by case.
The other resource I wanted to share to everyone, and this came up when I was visiting one of the shelters, is what happens if someone, say, goes to work or goes out for the day and leaves their animal with another person but doesn't come back. And after a certain length of time, 12, 14 hours, you feel that that owner is not coming back, you can reach out to the Peninsula Humane Society and let them know that the dog is at your shelter, that you're an official calling, and the animal would be picked up and placed into a protective custody hold. And that hold is for 30 days. If, God forbid, the person ended up in the hospital, their animal would be safely cared for in that amount of time, and then they could go and get the animal from the shelter. What the shelter is going to need is the name of the person, any contact information, any information that you have, because they're going to want to try to get in contact with that person as well. But that helps you with that burden. You don't have to be the daycare or the boarding kennel while you're trying to locate that resident. But again, it does have to be in a reasonable amount of time. I would say, anything past 12 or 14 hours.
Thanks, Lori. Another question, Lori, that's come in is about sometimes other clients making assumptions about animals having fleas. So sometimes, you know, a client in, say, a group shelter, a client gets a bug bite or a rash, and they automatically assume that it's fleas from their neighbor's service animal or assistance animal. How can housing providers or shelter providers assuage those fears around fleas?
I think that's a fair question to ask the client when they come in. Has your animal received flea protection? And if not, that's when you can get us on the phone and I can have Dr. Lewis come out and provide medication. It's not always the fleas. I mean, there's other bugs that can make the bites. Generally, people with their animals are caring for them and taking care of the fleas. But again, we can provide that service. She can get out there fairly quickly and it's taken care of. But feel free to ask that question when they, upon intake. You have an animal, when was the last time you had flea protection, or do you have flea protection? That's a fair question to ask.
Yeah, and just to clarify that, you know, you wouldn't be refusing entry to that animal or that person based on that, but in terms of working with them and if you do need to have that kind of conversation, yeah, which as Lori's discussed with me before.
I'm going to say how amazing it is that you have this wealth of resources in Lori and her team to address issues like this.
Mm-hmm.
Not every community has that, so definitely take advantage of it.
And Lori, another one that has come in is about how to juggle placement of animals. I know you talked about this a little bit, but it comes up a lot about if, say, there are clashing animal personalities and how shelters can better coordinate placements of various animals.
Sure. Again, dogs are going to bark at each other, and you're going to see the little dog act like a big dog and bark at the big dog. It's trying to get them visually separated. So if you can do separate areas, separate dorm areas, if the dogs are barking at each other, again, instructing that client, please remove your dog or move your dog. By putting a visual barrier between two dogs that are barking, they're going to stop. What they're doing is they're alerting, they see each other, and they react. So telling those two clients, hey, why don't you walk over here, you walk in this area, or come up with a different routine. And then the dogs are eventually going to get used to seeing each other and hopefully will calm down. But you have to accommodate them, and it would be putting them the furthest apart that you can. And sometimes the dogs get to know each other, and they're like, oh, okay, that dog's not bad or he's not aggressive, and they'll, you know, become calm around each other.
Wonderful, thank you. And I believe we've responded to all the questions in the chat. If you think we didn't respond to your question, please type it in again right now. I think we caught them all though, or if you have another question and you just haven't put it out there, please go ahead and type that in now. We can wrap up in a few minutes if we don't have more questions, but we'd love to hear more from you. And we also want to show you some tools and resources that we have before we wrap up. While we give people a little bit of time on questions, Lori, did you have anything else that you wanted to make sure that people hear today? You've already provided so much information, but is there anything else that you wanted to add before we close up?
No, I think just don't be afraid to reach out and ask. And if I don't have the answer, I'll try to find the answer for you or the resource. Keep in mind our new veterinary service. That's a great benefit to the community. And as I mentioned, we're just starting out, but Dr. Lewis can come and train your staff on anything about animals and make them feel comfortable with having animals in a housing situation. And I did just see a question come in. Are there any restrictions on animals in kitchen or food prep areas? Yes. Because of the environmental health services, they cannot be in a kitchen area where food is being prepared. They can be in the area, however, where food is consumed. but they can't be in the prep area.
Yeah, and again, just want to reiterate that you do want to be careful with particularly service animals, just making sure that that everyone is able to access the spaces that they need if you know, for reasons related to the disability that, or the disability related need that that animal is accommodating, that you're making sure to accommodate clients as much as possible, and making sure you're following the proper protocols to support them whenever possible.
Not to throw interactive process out there one more time, but I mean, that's really the safest bet, and especially, I mean, in any context, just really engaging in a conversation with a person to figure out how you could meet their needs wherever possible.
All right, well, we don't see any other questions up here. So I'm having a technical difficulty getting off our Q&A slide, which I don't totally mind because I love those puppies. But we might want to pop back and we kind of blaze through our resources slide. And again, we have a list, we'll have the list of emails of everyone who registered with HSA for this training. So if you sent them your email through the registration, we'll have it. If you didn't, please you're welcome to send a private chat on there with your email to us, and we'll add you to the distribution list for this webinar. We've already received one email that way, so any more that you want to send in. And we will distribute this webinar, we'll distribute the slides, which have all these links that we're about to share, as well as that recording, so you can share this with other people, because I know a lot of questions keep coming up and there are a lot of resources, but if someone hasn't heard this training, it might be a good place for them to start. So a couple of those resources available. First, I wanted to share the first little set here is a few different kind of explainers on fair housing rights, service animals in businesses and public spaces. This first one from Project Sentinel is very user-friendly. It's very kind of client-tenant facing. It has lots of cute pictures. It has great explanations of, you know, kind of things from the client or tenant perspective. It has some tips for them that aren't necessarily things that things that aren't necessarily legally required but are recommended for them, like documenting what they do and asking up front, and those kinds of things that are recommended for them, even if they aren't a legal requirement from the provider side. So these are really great kind of tenant-facing resources. The ones from Disability Rights California, these two have been updated recently. One is about assistance animals in housing, the other is about service animals in businesses and public spaces. They're kind of set up as FAQs, and those are really helpful as well. So recommend if you want to hand out or, you know, print these out so they're available in your waiting room or whatever. These are some great things to hand out and to look at. Also a bit more from kind of the legal side. Here we have the ADA information line, which Lori mentioned as a great resource, as well as their website, which has a lot of great explainers and pretty user-friendly information on it. For being the ADA website, it's pretty impressive, the utility of all the information they have on there for people. The DOJ overview of service animals is a useful explanation of kind of that legal background on service animals in public spaces and the protections and specifics around what you can ask, and lack of documentation requests, things like that. And there's also this HUD and DOJ joint statement on reasonable accommodation that just has some good explanations as well, and we wanted to share it because it specifically is from HUD, who funds a lot of housing programs. So I thought those might be useful to you all. So we'll send those out shortly. We're excited to be sharing all this information. I know questions will continue to come up. It's a complicated area. Every client is different, every animal is different, every situation is different. So please feel free to reach out. We are available here on our San Mateo team to support all of you as you support clients experiencing homelessness in the county. You can reach out to us at San Mateo at homebaseccc.org. Again, I'm Elizabeth Ream here with Ali Robbie. and Lori Morton-Fiesel's information at the county health system is available there as well, that email. So I'll give you a second to, in case you want to jot that down, but again, we'll be sharing these slides as well.
And if you send us a question with a really cute picture of a puppy, you know, bonus point.
Definitely. All right, well, thank you all so much. We're going to end the webinar a minute early, but we're really excited to keep taking your questions in the future. Thank you so much and have a wonderful rest of your day.